What a dramatic setting for a fundamental argument. Donald Trump taking his seat while a cold steel rain beat down Sunday on Paris's Arc de Triomphe for 100th anniversary commemorations of the end of World War I. The U.S. president had thrown his weight around earlier on Twitter, belittling his French counterpart's call for a European defense force. That was before he had to stand alongside sometimes nemesis Angela Merkel of Germany, while Emmanuel Macron delivered a speech that clearly sounded like a lecture on history, squarely directed at Trump. How does Macron's praise of patriotism and reviling of what he terms a new breed of nationalism resonate? Remembering 1918 is remembering the decimation of a Western civilization that thought itself invulnerable. It's also remembering that in the ashes of the Great War came the rise of the nation-states as we know them. And while some 60 world leaders were marking the end of fighting in Paris, in Warsaw they were celebrating exactly 100 years since the founding of modern-day Poland. Poland, where a hard-right nationalist government seems won over by Donald Trump's worldview. How different is the nationalism of today from that of 1918? And is this an argument that Emmanuel Macron can win? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at that patriotism versus nationalism dichotomy. And joining us, he's taking part in the peace forum that's been organized around the 100th anniversary commemorations of Armistice Day. Hungarian diplomat János Pastor, senior fellow at the Carnegie Climate Geoengineering Initiative, former UN Assistant Secretary General on Climate Change. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
I want to welcome as well Jérémy Guez, who teaches economics and international relations at the French Business School, HEC, the author of U.S., An Unlikely Decline and an Impossible Rebound.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back to the show. Welcome as well to historian and economist Pierre-Cyril Aucoeur, who teaches at the French School for Higher Learning, EHESS. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for the invitation.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. In 1918, the celebrations 100 years ago today in Paris were a mix. The joy of winning the war and relief that a carnage that killed 1/4 of all 20-year-old Frenchmen was finally over. Now, if you fast forward 100 years, there you had France's president grappling with a changing world, both then and now.
This vision of France as a generous nation with a vision which carries universal values has been, in those dark times, exactly the opposite of the selfishness of a people which only looks at its own interests. Because patriotism is the exact opposite of nationalism. Nationalism is its betrayal. By pursuing our own interests first, with no regard to others, we erase the very thing that a nation holds most precious, that which gives it life and makes it great, its moral values.
It's kind of is it a semantic exercise, pitting patriotism against nationalism? Or was he convincing to you, Jérémy Guez? Did he convince you that these are two very distinct notions?
I think they are very distinct notions. The so-called rise of the populist wave, and I don't think it is dismaying because they claim that label of populism. I think there's a guiding theme across countries, across parties. It's this notion of the world, this notion that the world is a zero-sum game. What you win, I lose. What I win, you lose. So that is key in nationalism. In patriotism, and you heard President Macron just argue that, it's the possibility of a positive-sum game, meaning there is value to compromise. There is value to talking. There is value to multilateralism. There is value to basically trying to create a business environment that will be constructive for your interest and for my interest. It is a very European and historical view of the world. But what I find striking is, yes, we were commemorating 1918, but I don't think this was a historical debate. I think this was a profound debate about two schools of thought, populism versus something I fail to find the right term to characterize just yet, but it's certainly an alternative school of thought.
Did he use the right words, or did he overplay his hand a little?
You have to bear in mind, I think, that Paris was at the heart of, I mean, was the center of the world yesterday with 80 plus leaders. So you have to play your hand and you have to push, I think, a little bit, especially this is a key debate, I think, and France plays a key role. What is most striking to me is that Trump and Macron seem to be born out of the same discontent, the same frustration, the same disillusion with politics in a wide range of countries, and in this case in the US and in France. Except that in France, what was completely novel was discontent proved true on the extreme left and on the extreme right, but there was a political offering at the center. Whereas 5-10 years ago, we would have said that represent 9-10% of the French electorate. He won an election. And this is where France becomes an incubator for something alternative to populism, something at the center of the spectrum, and something that is innovative, politically speaking.
Does it sell, though, Pierre-Cyril Aucoeur, in, you know, the working class towns of northern France or in the east, in the backwater areas of France and beyond? After all, he, in a way, is starting his campaign for those European elections, which are coming up in the spring.
No, it's certainly a good idea to revive the word patriotism in order to oppose nationalism. It's somewhat a rhetoric twist, as you suggested. But patriotism and even nationalism, to some extent, have been long a characteristic of the left in France from the French Revolution. And so and all the leaders have always had some kind of nationalist view. What is new with Macron is that he wants to build a nation at the European level, and that's really new. He didn't say that exactly, but it was clearly behind what he said. And building a nation.
He did in the first part of his speech celebrate the victory of the French in 1918. After all, France lost the most soldiers in World War I.
Exactly.
And they won the war.
They didn't win the war. Nobody won that war. The war was a destruction of Europe. And the only country which won that war was the US. And the US was very careful at winning the war and winning the peace. Winning the peace by avoiding the formation of a European Union. And that was very clear in what happened in the 1920s. And the great change after World War II is that the US accepted the idea of some European Union, understanding that it was the key to having peace in the future. And that was a great success for a number of years. But recently, because the US start not being uncontested as the only major country in the world because of the rise of China, they start being afraid of the others. And that's the real fear for us today, is that the US, being so powerful, is at the same time fearing that others can contest their leadership. And for us, for Europeans who have always considered the US as their main ally and as friends, it's really a problem to have such a contestful vision of the relationship between the US and Europe, which can undermine the European Union, because the Brexit is clearly something which is undermining the European Union, and other countries like Hungary, Poland, and others, to some extent, start undermining the Union too.
Yeah, the politicians playing on the fear, or they've been accused of it, of playing on an anxiety of a decline, of losing your identity. Last month at a campaign rally in Houston, Donald Trump described himself for the first time as a nationalist.
You know, they have a word. It sort of became old-fashioned. It's called a nationalist. And I say, really, we're not supposed to use that word. You know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist. Nationalist. Nothing. Use that word. Use that word.
Use that word. János Pastor, your reaction?
Well, I work on climate change issues, and I can tell you that climate change is not a nationalist issue. It is a global issue, and there is no way that any country, even the largest country, can address climate change on its own We have to be able to engage with different countries, work on the technologies, work on the solutions together, work on the science together. Otherwise, it's not going to happen.
And what country has so much science but the United States? Picking up on what you just heard there from Pierre Cyril, why is there this anxiety in the U.S. when it comes to the rest of the world right now? What do you make of what you just heard from Donald Trump?
Well, there are people in different parts of the world, not just in the U.S., who look at their world in a very narrow way. And I think that's what happens.
Is it a narrow way, or is it a fear of a genuine anxiety?
It's a genuine anxiety, especially if the flames are stoked by leaders to think about these things in a certain way. And there can be leaders who engage people and say, look at the world, how can we solve these problems together? And there are others who say, look at the world, let them do what they do, and we'll do our own solution.
Were you surprised when Donald Trump said those words at that rally in Houston, Jeremy Guez?
No, he was addressing a political rally. If my memory serves me right before the midterms, this was a political cry for mobilization and to basically remind everyone that no, we're not into political correctness and it's time for us to change. So no, it's not surprising. And I don't think that we have to belittle this problem that I think many Americans have about their own identity and what they stand for. I think this is a key debate right now in the United States. And there's a political process that brought Donald Trump to power. It's one in which, a very long-term process. Donald Trump, to me, is more a consequence than a real cause of the problem. But,
so what is that problem?
So it's interesting that right now we've always mocked the United States as a country without any history, especially when we were Europeans. To me, the problem is that all of a sudden the United States is discovering its history. And it's wondering, who in the world are we? What do we stand for? And if it's not going to be for the, I don't even know what that means, but the traditional American, then how do we deal with influx of refugees? How do we deal with the fact that English is indeed the official language, but there is that second language, namely Spanish, that basically is spoken by an even greater amount of Americans today? How do we deal with all of these questions? I think this is the strange twist of history where America is looking for its own identity.
Yeah,
now,
that's one point of view. I agree that's exactly what Trump wants us to discuss, because he wants the issues to be identity, nation, or future. He doesn't want to discuss social problems, the environment, which are issues which will divide its own constituency, because he doesn't want the Republican Party to split over environment, over social problems, because actually most of the people who elect Trump, they should vote against him for social reasons. So they vote for him only because he's able to make them fair as their future identity grounds.
Let me turn the problem around another way. You wrote in a piece for Le Monde over the weekend how 100 years ago, you can't underestimate the fact that there was a scramble for raw materials taking place around the globe. And the fall of the Ottoman Empire is also the beginning of the rise of oil, right? There's all kinds of raw materials. You talked about rubber, steel, etc. around the world. Look at the United States today. Maybe Donald Trump is saying some of this stuff because he can afford to say it. After all, the U.S. suddenly, with shale oil and gas, isn't so reliant anymore on the rest of the world. It owns the internet to a certain degree, since all the big major tech companies are in California. Is it just simply that Donald Trump is throwing his weight around because he can?
He can what? He can wait. He can take revenues from all these assets you describe, and the U.S. do it. So they don't want to share that, and it will end up with catastrophic climate change that we already observe some dimensions. I think the U.S. are relatively protected against that, because actually the global warming will affect some southern regions of the U.S., but they will migrate somewhat to the north, and they won't suffer a lot compared to other countries. If you compare the Bangladesh with the U.S., who will suffer, it's absolutely clear. And they don't want to pay their share in something which will be a global problem, because they maybe think they will be able to avoid the main costs. I think it's an error, and California today shows it. Looks
California
like
with these forest fires.
I think the United States is not as protected when it comes to climate change as you said. First of all, sea level rise. There are major cities in the United States that will have a real challenge in not so long into the future. And you've seen the fires in California. You've heard the governor of California who said yesterday that it is the new normal.
The new abnormal.
And today he changed it to the new abnormal. Yeah. That this is what we can expect. It will get hotter. It will get drier. And let's face it, for the last, I don't know how many years, the scientists have been telling us through their models that this is what you can expect with climate change. And now we're getting it, and yet the world is not reacting sufficiently. And it's not just about the fires, it's about the crazy weather patterns in many different parts of the world.
So why is it increasingly difficult to, well, come up with global solutions to problems?
Well, it's difficult when you first of all, when you don't have the political support that you need. We had here 3 years ago, just not so long ago, here in Paris, we had 185 heads of states who came here and who all said the same thing. We have a real problem, let's fix it. And they did it, they signed an agreement, they went home, they ratified the treaty faster than any other treaty of that nature. And then what? Then they said, well, we've done our work now, we can move on. And no, you can't move on because they are not, no country is doing enough, even to do what they said they would do in Paris 3 years ago. So we need, first of all, the kind of leadership that can push this system and do the things that we have to do. And then we need different actors. And some of them are acting very nicely. We have cities, we have private sector companies, we have civil society organizations who are doing lots of interesting things. But all of that needs to be channeled because the task is huge.
All right, when we come back, we're going to take a look at how the nationalist fiber is on this continent. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're speaking as world leaders and players are gathered here in Paris for 3 days as part of centennial commemorations of the end of World War I. There's a peace forum taking place in the French capital. One of those attending, he's the former UN Assistant Secretary General for Climate Change, former Hungarian diplomat János Pastor. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Jérémy Guez, who teaches at HEC, the French Business School, the author of US, An Unlikely Decline and an Impossible Rebound, and historian and economist Pierre-Cyril Hautecoeur, who is with the French Institute of Higher Learning, EHESS. We were describing just before the break a global approach. Of course, remember in 1918, the US had a president who had a global approach. His name was Woodrow Wilson. But then he goes home, falls ill, and the U.S. Senate never ratifies the United States' entry into what was the forerunner of the United Nations, the League of Nations. The U.S. never entered the League of Nations, and that was, I guess you could say, one of the reasons that organization never had any teeth in it.
Actually, it had more than what is usually said. It was a good place for debate for years, and nobody expected much more from it.
But there was this blowback against globalism.
Yes, what happened is that a lot of people in the US wanted to come back to before, not to take the responsibility of the world, because it became suddenly such a huge weight for US voters to understand that their country was leading the world, not only in terms of ideas, which was nice, as the First Republic and so on, but it was also to take responsibilities.
So do you think now, it's been a quarter century since the fall of the Berlin Wall nearly, and do you feel as though it's the same thing, that the United States is tired of the Pax Americana, as some academics call it?
No, I don't think so. I think they are afraid of rising China, and they don't know how to cope with it, because China is not only a challenge to the power of America, but it's also starting to be a challenge to the ideology of democracy, the idea of free markets. when you discuss with Chinese leaders, they want to substitute their view of central state harmonization, of planning and so on, to the ideas coming from the US. And they really have an agenda on that, which is something quite new for the US compared to, it's somewhat back to the USSR period, but with someone who is not as clearly antagonistic as the Soviet Union was.
And just before the break, we were talking about how on climate change you need a multilateral approach. This Monday in Paris, the French launching this initiative when it comes to cybersecurity before UNESCO, which is the United Nations Education and Science arm. They want to have all countries agree to basic regulations. A week ago, China had its own cybersecurity conference. It's not a signatory of what the French are suggesting. So there's blowback against multilateralism that's not just coming from the United States, John.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct, except that China is offering a version of global governance. It is contributing. It is has its eye on the issue of climate change to some extent. It has a view on basically what political stability is supposed to be about. It has a view on what economic stability is supposed to be about. It seems to be the adult in the room in this trade war between the United States and China, again, to a certain degree. So it is offering a version of global stability. On the other hand, we have Trump, and I think the problem that you are raising is a problem of time horizon as well. Because don't get me wrong, agree with you 100%. But there is an assumption that we both share that Donald Trump doesn't share, is that this is an immediate present danger. For them, it is not proven, and perhaps it's a long-run issue. So if it's not proven and a long-run issue, what's on the head of the agenda? It's going to be the rise of China, the cybersecurity threat. It's going to be the issue of inequalities and bringing jobs back home. So we got the Trump nationalist, populist version. I'm hoping that Emmanuel Macron comes to the table and agreed, it is branding. Every business is branding, and politics is no exception, but bringing something in the middle, because I don't want to live in a world with Chinese standards and norms, but I don't want to live in the world with that dictatorship of the very, very present short run.
I want to talk a little bit more about 1918 because, well, it's the 100th anniversary, I guess you could say, of your country, right? Hungary, because it was the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Same thing in Poland. On Sunday, there was a mass rally in Warsaw to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Poland's rebirth as a nation.
Let's go together. Let this be our joint march. Let it be a march for everyone. A march where everyone wants to be and feels good marching for Poland.
Marching for Poland. That's the president of Poland, who hails from the Law and Justice Party, a hardline nationalist party, which is in power in Poland. The rally saw people from the far right converge from across Europe, not just Poles. What were your thoughts when you saw that the way the commemorations unfolded in Warsaw on Sunday?
Well, I'm not a specialist in this area, but I tell you, I don't feel good about it. I feel that we're kind of moving back in history, and that's not a good thing. I much prefer to look forward and try to find a way, perhaps in our own way, each of us, to explain that there are issues, there is science, there is. It may not be on the agenda, as you said earlier, for example, the climate change issue, but there are ways to explain to everybody, to normal people, that what's happening in New Orleans and what's happening on the coast of Florida is actually happening, and what's happening in some of the other countries as well. So I don't see this as a lost cause. I think we're going through a certain period which we need to be careful about and find ways to build on those forces that can actually bring us out of this into a better future, instead of going back to somewhere that doesn't actually exist.
So if we draw again the parallel with 1918, Pierre Cyril Aucoeur, you had at the time these blocs that started to emerge, right? Because you had the Soviet Union starting to form. You had then a decade later the rise of Nazism, the rise of fascism, which started earlier in Italy, and so these sort of blocs that start to form here in Europe. What are your thoughts when you see what's going on in Poland, in Hungary?
I think some people just want to revive country-level politics in front of the European Union building, and they won't succeed. The only thing they can do is revive conflicts with their neighbors, and we are starting to have conflicts about refugees and migrants, which won't. Nobody can gain that except for suppressing free circulation within Europe, and then it will end up with trade wars, and it will end up with new wars. Maybe not.
So why is there Jeremy Guez was talking about a short-term electoral gain? Why is there short-term electoral gain? You could even say the Brexit referendum was won on these terms.
So short-term gain is that people are afraid. They don't know what will happen to them in the near future. So if a populist comes and propose simple solutions, they think that it's easy to understand, so they understand it and they vote for it. The problem is that complex societies require complex solutions, and we must be able to explain how these complex solutions work rather than the simple ones which go toward wars.
Pierre-Cyril, you were mentioning earlier how in all of this, the United States, when it looks at Europe, is not retreating from the world like it was in 1918. It's simply imposing a different worldview. That's a sentiment shared by Poland's centrist former prime minister. He's now the president of the European Council, Donald Tusk, who was back home Sunday for those 100th anniversary of Poland commemorations.
In this great global challenge, the United States, which has traditionally been our closest partner, is behaving differently. I want to say that it is perhaps the first time in history, at least to my recollection, that we have an American administration that is not enthusiastic, to say the least, about a united and strong Europe. I am talking here about facts and not propaganda.
Jeremy Guez, is he right? Or when Trump, tweets when he arrives in Paris that he finds Macron's idea of a European army insulting, this kind of thing, is it just, political grandstanding to hog the limelight?
It's hard to understand what he thinks ultimately, because Trumpism to me is opportunity pushed to the highest level, opportunism pushed to the extreme degree. So the truth of the moment is the truth of the moment. What I find striking, to address your question, what Pierre-Cyril was saying is, to me, nationalism or populism, it's the power of the bumper sticker slogan. If you can fit it as a slogan, then it's going to work. And the way you have to fight the slogan is you have to sit down, educate, start talking, and that takes a whole lot of time. So indeed, I mean, to address this, he doesn't even know what to think of Europe. He certainly would want Europe to be strong.
But is Donald Tusk right when he says that Donald Trump wants to undermine the European Union?
It's not entirely clear, because what does he want? He wants Europe to pay, quote unquote, its fair share inside NATO. Europe wouldn't be able to do that if Europe was weak. So on that end, when he meets President Macron and says, I am in favor of a strong Europe, then I believe him, because that is in sync with the expectation that European nations should pay their fair share in NATO. The problem, though, is that when you compare that to other visions, as in on the Iran deal, on so on, Europe is not following us. He is doing many things to undermine the European Union at the same time. It is very hard to draw a guiding thread and a logic in what he's saying, because the truth is the truth of the moment that might be contradicted the day after tomorrow.
Janos Pastor?
Yeah, one of the things we haven't mentioned much is the role of information and misinformation in all this. And there's a lot of information floating around, some of which is simply not true. And again, going back to the climate change era that I know, there has, for example, even in the US, that has not always been like it is today. 20 years ago, the situation about the availability of information and the willingness of the society, the American society, to address the issue was much higher than today. And why is that? Because a lot of misinformation has been spread by certain, let's face it, let's be clear, economic and political forces. So that is helping the populist tendencies that you historians are talking about. So that's something we need to recognize and try to do something about it.
The difference, I guess you could say, Pierre Cyril Aucoeur, is 100 years ago, I suppose we were on the cusp of a mass media revolution. That radio hadn't yet entered people's homes. It was to come, what, in 1920 in the U.S., a little bit later here in Europe. In 2018, we don't know what the current mass media revolution we have is, where it's leading us, and what kind of politician it's going to favor in the long run.
I hope nobody will say in the future that Adolf Hitler was the first one to use the radio efficiently, and that Donald Trump was the first one to use Twitter. But to some extent, mastering simple messages using Twitter is fantastically efficient and fantastically dangerous, because it's the most stupid instrument for spreading wrong ideas, but very efficient one.
So what do you do when you're Emmanuel Macron now? That Paris Peace Forum again, coupled with the conference on cybersecurity at UNESCO, the French arguing for a global approach to policing and regulating web activity, saying that, quote, we recognize the necessity of a strengthened multi-stakeholder approach and of additional efforts to reduce risks to the stability of cyberspace and the buildup of confidence, capacity, and trust. Laudable aims that don't fit in a Donald Trump tweet or anyone's tweets. I don't know how much he's getting his message across with that.
No, it's true. Now, what people can understand easily is that united, you are stronger than divided. And that's the force of the United States of America. They are called United States, and they are strong because they are united. And Europeans can understand that united, they could be stronger. And being stronger, they could put topics on the agenda and impose those topics at the agenda, which no European country is able to do alone. They could also enforce their laws, refuse to obey the laws of other countries where they go in contradiction to theirs, impose their own courts to be used for conflicts on their firms or their people. This is quite easy to understand. The problem, to some extent, to me, is that up to now, the European Union, partly because it was the simplest thing to agree on, was mostly a free market area, which was very nice, and was also dominated by an ideology of decreasing the weight of the states. And this led to the European Union to be less powerful than rich.
Do you feel like that's changing?
I think that's changing a little. Some leaders understand that they have to renounce to part of their power or transfer it to the European Union and tell it to the people, which up to now has never been really said to the people. We have to say the truth, and the truth is that we need to be united in order to be strong at the world level.
We need to be united to be strong at a world level. Does that sell if you're campaigning, again, for next spring's European elections, Jérémy Guez?
In yesterday's world, no. In tomorrow's world, you better hope it does. And you better hope that you work at building that brand and at making it efficient. I hear this message in no other capital than in France, to go on the economics front. Donald Trump, I'll bring your jobs back home. What does Emmanuel Macron respond? I can't do that. That would be going against the march of technology. It would be going against the march of globalization. And if I ever said that, I would be a liar. But what I can promise is give you, French citizens, and give every single one of your children all of the tools they need to reinvent and to start being efficient in this very brutal world. Same thing. This can't fit on a bumper sticker, but it's going to be the type of arguments in the future. Emmanuel Macron, if he wants to be successful in what he launched yesterday, is going to have to become mighty good at doing. Educating and bringing people around the complexity of the system rather than the false simplicity.
When you look now, Janos Pastor, at Eastern Europe, and we mentioned Poland and Hungary. Hungary, where what? There's 2/3 of the population that supports Viktor Orban, who proudly says that he's illiberal in his approach to democracy. Nonetheless, he's pro-European and wants to stay, in fact, in the main center-right voting bloc, the EPP. And same thing in Poland. People say they're pro-European. So are they pro-European? Are they for the unity that was just been described there by Pierre Cyril?
Well, the reality is that Europe has been very helpful to those countries, financially, economically, in terms of investment. A lot of investment resources came from the European Union channels, and that's helped economic growth, and it helped to strengthen the political positions of these leaders. So they have to be for Europe, otherwise it doesn't make sense. So, but whether they stand for all the values of Europe, that's another question. And I think that we clearly see that is.
How does the ordinary Hungarian today see the EU?
I'm not the right person to answer because I don't live there, so it's difficult for me to judge that. But you've seen that 2/3 of the population is voting for the current government, and I would say that they probably see the European Union with the eyes that are provided to them by the current leadership, and that's it's a sort of a mixed bag.
Finally, when we look now at when the dust settles on this 100th anniversary commemoration, and again we open the show seeing with all those world leaders gathered under the Arc de Triomphe in the rain there underneath the arc next to the tomb of the unknown soldier, has the emphasis been in the right place when it comes to remembering what 100 years ago was all about?
Not clear. I think the destructive impact of the war is not enough remembered today. There has been a lot of work by historians in the recent decades on the day-to-day life of soldiers on the front and so on. It's very good. The problem is that people have nobody left in their families because not only the soldiers are died, but their sons and even their grandsons. So nowadays, almost nobody remembers truly the experience of the war. And we look at wars on TV and we think, oh, it's terrible, but, we switch to something else. And nobody remembers how terrible is that experience. And it's terrible not for the leaders. It's terrible for the people, for all the people. And we see that in Yemen. You see that in many countries in the world, but we don't experience it. And we have to
so on that point,
have some experience of that.
Why is it that France is not like Britain, where, the British wear the poppy, and it's about exactly what you described, remembrance of the dead and the loss. Why is it not like that as much here?
I think it takes different forms. People have been interested. There have been lots of TV shows, lots of debates, and so on, and so on. A number of conferences, and so on. But it's necessary to do all these efforts. But I don't think it's enough to make people fear the next potential war. And actually, we are in danger of fighting wars in the future.
All right, we'll leave it there. Pierre Cyril au cœur, I want to thank you. I want to thank Jérémy Guez, Janos Pastor. Please stay with us, though. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Charlie James.
Hello there. So I want to go back to Macron's original statement. Not only did he make this comment about patriotism being the exact opposite of nationalism, during that ceremony, but he also tweeted it from both his French and his English accounts. So it's clear that this was a sentiment that he wanted to have greater legs than just at that ceremony. And you can see from the number of likes and retweets that this definitely went far. And according to several media outlets, this weekend was the official end of the good-natured relationship between Macron and Trump. The Atlantic headline here saying Trump's bromance with Macron fizzles spectacularly. And the New York Times, playing on the word for good-natured or friendliness, said bonhomie, c'est fini, as Trump and Macron seek to diffuse tension. Later in the article, it says no cheeks were kissed, no friendly rubs given, none of the bonhomie of their earlier meeting was on display. So much
the handshakes were still a little grabby, though, I noticed.
Yeah, but that's like a power move.
Oh, okay.
That's that they go back and forth with. Right. It just keeps escalating more and more, the handshakes. But Trump also caught a lot of flack this weekend for a number of reasons. First was his cancellation of a visit to an American cemetery northeast of Paris due to rain. Now, that problem, according to his team, was logistical.
Helicopters couldn't fly.
Helicopters couldn't fly, difficulties with the motorcade. But the fact that Macron, Merkel, and other leaders made it to their events that day kind of didn't sit so well with some people. A couple of tweets here to show you. Nicolas Soames, who is a British politician, also the grandson of Winston Churchill, saying they died with their face to the foe, and that pathetic, inadequate, real Donald Trump couldn't even defy the weather to pay his respects to the fallen. So that shared a lot. Also, American Democratic politician and also a veteran, John Kerry, tweeting, President Donald Trump, a no-show because of raindrops. Those veterans the president didn't bother to honor fought in the rain, in the mud, and the snow, and many died in the trenches for the cause of freedom. So this was something that got a lot of blowback from people this Veterans Day weekend in the United States. And then also, while Macron and Trump's relationship appeared cold, Trump and Putin seemed as jovial together as always. This picture getting a lot of attention online of Putin's arrival, his late arrival to that Armistice Day ceremony yesterday.
Yeah, there was a bit of a power play there too.
He has a tendency to do this. This is not uncommon with Putin at all, showing up late as a way to kind of assert his importance. So they did all wait for him. But upon his arrival, you can see the stark contrast between everyone else's face, looking at him with this sort of neutral look, and Donald Trump giving a rare big toothy grin. We actually don't see him smile like this that much. So this getting shared a lot, and one particularly funny reply from a political strategist with Rick Wilson saying, get yourself a lover who looks at you the way that Trump looks at Putin. This photo from, or it's a screen grab actually from Russian state television showing Trump appearing to wink at Putin from across the table at a luncheon at the Elysee Palace, also getting shared a lot. So while Macron's assertion at that ceremony that nationalism is the opposite of patriotism, many people took that to be directed specifically at Trump. We have to remember, and as you guys just spoke about for an hour, this is a global problem. Not problem, but it's a global trend. It's a trend of nationalism. And the BBC was out with a new study today showing that in India, nationalism is a driving force behind fake news in the country, that people want to appear patriotic or nationalist to the point where they don't even want to check where the source of where things come from. So that's interesting today from the BBC as well.
All right, we'll leave it there. I want to thank you so much, Charlie James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.